So in my presentation yesterday, I spoke about the difference between digital features and being a digital organisation. So just to quickly recap, the LIXI2 standards are great for building straight-through processing using a single data model across a variety of products and transactions. And you can use it to capture data from the needs analysis, customer interviews and declarations, all the way through to lodgement, all of the back-channel messaging, including supporting documentation, loan conditions, errors, requests for valuations, LMI, serviceability calcs, credit assessment, document preparation, settlement itself. And they also cover all of the same flows for account variations. And it includes all of the data required to verify income and expenses, provided either by a data aggregator from scraping or directly from open banking. We're already capable of supporting all that. Now, today's presentation, I'm not focusing on these in more detail. Instead, I'm focusing on the areas that I believe can have the single biggest positive impact on an organisation that chooses to adopt LIXI2 very deeply. And I'd argue that the biggest fundamental difference between a neobank or a fintech and a traditional bank or software provider is the way they build software. More modern organisations tend to use a particular set of development practices. And these modern development practices utilise automation to an extreme extent with the purpose of discovering bugs, defects and issues as early as possible. And why? Because the cost of fixing a defect, sorry, my slides aren't moving along, are they? Let's try that again. Sorry, give me a moment. Isn't that the way? We'll try that again. So just bear with me for a moment. There we go. And why? Because the cost of fixing a defect increases exponentially with the stage at which it is discovered. And while this graph can show the cost of fixing a bug found in gathering the requirement stage can grow to 30 times greater if it's not discovered until after it's released into production, I've seen estimates that appear much greater than that 30 times, as much as 20 times higher again. And this graph is what's motivated the shift left movement in software testing. And in its simplest form, the shift left movement encourages a test early, test often approach. Essentially, shifting the discovery of errors as far left on this graph as possible, therefore lowering the cost of addressing the errors. Now, Agile and DevOps have really given it a boost with continuous integration and delivery methodologies, embedding testing earlier and earlier in the software delivery lifecycle. So today, I'm just hoping to give you a taste of the type of automation that we've been using, and I can really see the benefit for implementers to use if you want to start discovering issues earlier rather than later. Now, firstly, it's worth remembering that LIXI Lab, which is our standards management environment, it's our own private installation of the open source community edition of GitLab. So all of the artifacts we maintain are just flat files managed in a Git repository. Now, Git is far and away the most used source code control system at the moment. And whether you're using GitHub, GitLab, Bitbucket, they pretty much can all sit on top of Git. Now, your source code control is generally the central point around which your entire software delivery lifecycle revolves. So if you're doing any continuous integration already, any automated build, deploy, or test from your source code, it's highly likely that you can incorporate components of the automation that I want to show you here today into your build process, and you can do that with a very small amount of code. It can be as little as a few lines of code. Now, remember that this is just a taste. The really great thing about automation is when you start to connect up various components in an automated way, you start finding ways of testing things that were never obvious or apparent at the start. Now let's start with the basics. If you currently need to download our standards, you'll probably be logging onto our website, browsing to the release pages, and downloading the latest schemas. It's quite manual. What instead if you wanted to automatically download all of the LIXI standards, including the latest ones, on a scheduled basis? Well, firstly, let's just show you how easy it is to fetch all of the latest LIXI2 standards. And it's as simple as using the git clone command. Now, if you're not a programmer, bear with me. This is a very short demo just to show you how trivially easy it can be. So here I am in a new empty directory, and all I'm going to do is use git clone to copy our LIXI2 schema project locally. Now, this project's available to all members. You just need to log on to LIXI Lab, which you can request on the website. So it's copying them all down. It takes a moment. Then once it's done, I'll do a directory listing. There we go. I'll quickly do a directory listing. You can see that there's a new schemas folder there. I can browse to the XSD folder, which contains all of the XSD schemas. The JSON ones are there as well, of course. And we're done. So just with a single line of code, you can pull all of the LIXI2 schemas, including the latest, into any build or test process. Now, in addition to the schemas, we have a repository of samples, which is also really useful for all sorts of testing purposes. Alternatively, you might be using code to generate your own samples for regression testing, whether that's for unit testing or an entire end-to-end process. And you might want to validate an entire library of samples. So the clone process is identical to the last example, so I'm not repeating it here. But once you've cloned the samples and the schemas, you can execute a very short script to validate every sample XML in the repository. And it's trivial. Simply loop through the files in the directory and use the LIXI Python library to validate the samples. Now, for the non-programmers amongst you, just close your eyes, but be assured that it's very easy. In fact, I walked my 11-year-old son through it since he's doing Python at school, and there was nothing in there that freaked him out. One thing that comes up occasionally is, what if I'm not a Python shop? Well, most testing setups are supported by a container management framework such as Docker and Kubernetes or serverless like Lambda. And all of the automation I'm talking about here works brilliantly in these frameworks. And we are talking about a very few lines of code. So great, now I've cloned the samples, I've cloned the standards, and I've validated all of the samples against the schemas. Well, that's great, but what if I want to evaluate the samples against a variety of business rules, something a little more complicated, say some conditional logic? So for example, what if I want to evaluate whether I've interpreted the LIXI documentation correctly, and I want to maximize my interoperability and check my library of samples or check samples that are created in real time? So our library of business rules in Schematron are an ideal way to demonstrate that concept. Now you can use any one of our base Schematron files or use it to build your own. We've already got over 1,000 rules written and we're building more every single day. So once again, retrieving all of the business rules is an identical process to that last clone, so I won't repeat it. And once you've cloned the Schematron files, it only requires a single extra line of code to the previous code block to enable business rule testing. So once I've created an instance of the message in code, all I need to do to validate that message using Schematron is provide the Schematron file that I want to check. So you can see we've now got some basic building blocks of a test framework. I've got samples that can be used to check schemas and rules. I've got rules that can be used to check samples and schemas, and I've got schemas that can be used to check the samples and the rules. Each component provides a useful resource to test the others. Now this seems trivially easy. How do I combine these in a useful way to support my change process with much more automation? Now I've got to say the use cases are endless, but imagine you're upgrading your systems to use a newer version of the LIXI schema. Now all of your regression samples are now the old version. What if you want to automatically roll these forward to the latest version, validate every sample against the latest schema, and revalidate against the business rules? You might do this to find out if anything in the new release breaks any of your existing samples. Well, that's no problem at all. It's only a few more lines of code and you're done. Another useful test you might want to apply is a coverage test. Do I have samples that represent every different part of the LIXI schema that I use? If my test cases don't cover all of the parts of the schema that I use and my code relies upon it, it's probable that my test cases insufficiently cover all of the possibilities. Again, with relatively few lines of code, implementing a sample coverage test is really quite easy. Great. So validating the messages against the schema and the schematron seems easy. What else might I do? Well, one framework that many of our members have started using extensively is customization by restriction. This gives you an automated way of customizing the LIXI schema to give you a subset that's specific to you. If you don't do equipment finance, you can chop out all of those elements and attributes. If you only want to allow 5 products, you can replace the product code string with an enumerated list of your exact product codes. Even better, insert your own definitions or mapping information into the customization instructions, and these get injected into the schema. It really does make the schema your own. And you can get a customized version of all of the LIXI documentation, including your own documentation embedded. The framework not only gives you a 100% compatible LIXI schema, but once you've set it up, you can automatically reapply the customizations to every future release automatically. And this is incredibly useful to help you stay up to date with any release of LIXI with an absolute bare minimum of fuss. So now, once I've generated a custom schema, what else can I automate? Well, firstly, I'd just remind you that a schema is not a document to be read. It's a key artifact that you want to program with. Generate your own documentation of any sort, or use industry standard commercial tools with it. The choice is yours. You might want to auto-generate all of the classes you use to either consume or publish LIXI messages. And we've published blog posts on each of these auto code gen options. Ideally, you want to use these at the core of your code and simply maintain the layer that integrates those LIXI2 classes into your own internal representation of the data and allows you to focus on the code that really adds value, and you use automated code for the rest. Now, our schemas are published as XML and JSON schemas, but what if you need to coexist with both? Well, we've created converters that you can use to automatically convert one to the other. Using these, even if you are only using JSON, you can still access the value from schematron despite it being only for XML. It's only one line of code to convert from JSON to XML, and then you can use the schematron. Now, what about APIs? That's what it's all about these days. Well, why not automatically generate the detail of your APIs based on the schema itself? You can automatically generate OpenAPI or Swagger specifications in a standard format, so any LIXI2 APIs can be consistently and easily used with tools like Postman for even more automated API testing. We've published blog posts and projects in LIXI Lab that can help you get started with these. Additionally, LIXI2 provides a full structural specification. What do I mean? Well, there's enough information in the LIXI2 schema to give you all of the primary key and foreign key information you would need to build a relational database directly from the schema definition. We've blogged about creating a database from the schema using Microsoft's Entity Framework. Alternatively, you might want to use a tool like Liquibase to version control the database off the schema. You might also want to automate mapping between data models. You might want to receive a LIXI2 message and have a framework to automatically generate the code to process that message into a different format or structure. Again, the customization by restriction framework gives you the ability to embed those mapping instructions directly in your custom schema. And at the very least, analysts can document the mapping and have it directly available in your custom schema. Now, the last area of automation that I'd like to cover today is the generation of user forms for developers and analysts to be able to quickly combine components of automation to give them the tools to really efficiently perform a LIXI2 integration. Let's say you've customized a schema, you've used the business rules library that we've published as a base and developed more rules that are specific to your organization. For example, if the product code is XYZ, ensure that the occupation is accountant and the applicant's member number for the certified practicing accountant professional body has been populated. You might have developed a library of samples selected from the LIXI2 sample repository and extended them to your own so your coverage test reports 100% of the paths that you're interested in. You've auto-generated the API specs to receive the LIXI2 message, and you've auto-generated the code that sits behind the API, processes the messages and stores them in a database for further processing. All of that process is rerun with every new release of the LIXI standard, including auto-rolling all of the samples, auto-deploying the API, and regression testing the entire library of samples so that within minutes of the latest LIXI release, you've got an automatically generated report showing all of the changes to the schema that you might need to consider because they've either generated a coverage test issue or they've broken a test somewhere. Brilliant. Now, what about auto-generating a user interface for loading a sample message, allowing an analyst to edit that message, evaluate all the business rules, and resubmit that message to the API for a single test run? Well, we've done that, and the UI is HTML5, JavaScript, and CSS, so it's completely local and can run directly in any browser. And we've done that in a framework within LIXI Lab that we're happy to share. And what does it look like? Here's an example. So I'll just open a sample file from our repository. And you can see once that loads, it auto-validates the rules to check that everything's okay. So that sample's okay. You can see the documentation from the schema embedded in the form. It's really great for BAs just to look at the data right alongside the definitions. You can see the XML itself right there in the form. Now let's force a rule to be broken. In this case, let's assume I accidentally selected Austria instead of Australia. I'm sure it's not the first time it's happened. And when I run the rules, I expect to see errors. It doesn't make sense that I've entered an Australian state of New South Wales, despite the fact that I've selected Austria. Clearly, once we change it back to Australia, the rules check is once again clear. Another little example I'd like to show is that also validates credit license numbers. Now, a neat thing about this check is that when the attribute in LIXI is just a string with no restrictions. By using an automated process that extracts all the valid ACL numbers from the ASIC website, we automatically generate the schematron rule. And this is a really neat approach to give you very fine-grained control over lots of areas within the schema at a really low cost, very efficient. Now, you notice this form also has embedded our demo API. We don't really have time to show that here today, but feel free to register for an API key on the website if you'd like to try it out. Now, just remember, once again, all of this is automatically generated directly from the schema. And we do it as part of our continuous integration, continuous build process. So that the instant we've added a new attribute, it's UI for our analysts to use all of the existing samples to use as a basis for any new samples that cover the new attribute. So just to recap, getting to the end, I hope I've given you a flavour for the type of automation that we're using actively here at LIXI when we're managing the standards. And I'd like to see our community to use a lot more in order to shift left on the software delivery lifecycle to reduce the cost of those data integrations using LIXI2. And as I said before, it's only once you start plugging the various components together with automation to the real opportunities start to present themselves.